This is going to be a follow-up to my video on opening up a second front. If you remember that video, what I explained was that this is something that you see at the higher levels very often, that top players use this strategy of playing on multiple sides of the board to break down the resistance of their opponents. And conversely, that at the more beginner levels in chess, we don't get to see the strategy in action very much, as it's just not needed. But who better to demonstrate this strategy than the best player in the world, Magnus Carlsen? So I found this game of his recently from the European Team Championships. He was white, and he is playing Hjörvar Stein Gretarsen from Iceland. And Magnus is white in this position, but we're going to start by looking at Black's perspective. So to be honest, I don't really like this position as Black because he's the one facing all the questions. First of all, White has the advantage of the two bishops. And I might like to trade one of them, but unfortunately that means opening up the white rook. So that's an immediate concession, and the A-pawn becomes rather weak. I mean, there's also the issue of Black's pawns being extended in front of the king, which doesn't mean his king is about to come under an attack, but certainly he's going to have to watch that part of the board for the rest of the game. There's also an open file over here. So White has ideas sometimes of d4, d5. He has to watch out sometimes maybe from ideas from this side. So basically, I'm not in love with Black's position starting out, and I really wasn't sure what Black should do here. But, objectively, Black is not doing too badly yet. And he actually chose a pretty decent bishop maneuver, which at first I really didn't appreciate. It's not a very obvious one why somehow putting the bishop to h5 and then maybe to g6 is so good. But I guess he's also kind of getting out of the way of that fork idea. That could be one of the main points. So knight f3 happened, and here it looks like Black missed a really important point. Like, you really got to ask yourself, why did Carlsen move his knight here? I mean, what exactly is it doing? It recently was there, it moved to d2, now it's moving back. Why? And it's actually quite surprising that Black did not ask themselves that question, because they certainly would not have played the move king g7 as a response. Actually, White is threatening knight h4. Pretty simple move based on the fact that, if you take, you get into a pin and you lose your knight right away. So the knight just can't be taken and he gets into f5. So you would never want to let your opponent's knight into f5, right? Which is why it would have been better to prophylactically move this knight back to d7. Then there's no more knight h4. And actually, the computer has this idea of moving this knight backwards because it's not really doing anything on c6, right? Moving it backwards, moving it here. That actually could be another point of why it was a good idea to move away this bishop from e6. But Black has to be quite clever in maneuvering in this position. Like, all these knight retreats backwards are, they're not obvious. Well, Black unfortunately messed up quite a bit with this move, and he let Carlsen play here. Carlsen must have been, I assume, very surprised that he was allowed to just carry out his idea, and that, his opponent essentially even stepped into the fork. Well, the bishop went back, and the knight got in. So this is a clear gain for White. He took his opponent's bishop. So now it's two bishops versus two knights. I guess the only thing that we have going for us as Black is that the position is still closed. Otherwise, it would be really, really game over if the position opened up. By the way, now we can start looking at it from White's side. So the interesting part for Black kind of ended. Now it's going to be more the focus on how White is going to convert their advantage. So Black plays knight d7, queen e2, queen e8. I suppose he wants to maybe play knight e7, chase the rook out at some point. Well, right now f7 is hanging, so we got to do something about that. And okay, here's part one of Carlsen's plan, right? Yeah, this is a moment, you guys might struggle with. You might be like, wow, why am I not just winning on the F file? I'm so powerful there, right? But you can't win the game there. Your opponent is defending. So what do we do when we can't win the game in the main fields of action? We look for other parts of the board to make progress on. And therefore, Carlsen starts with the H pawn. He's not even planning to take because that's not really too dangerous to black. But he does lead that pawn into H5. But first, we have to ask ourselves, do we want to let that knight take our bishop? What do you guys think? You've watched a couple of my videos already, right? So I think you know the answer to that. Of course not. We got to move the bishop back. I mean, bishops must be saved as long as they have potential. I know it looks weird to move the bishop to a more passive position behind these pawns, but he has potential. He will eventually become actually really strong again. But in order for him to see that day, he's got to live today. So, yeah, I got a little philosophical there. Knight G6. And our pawn is hanging. We got to make a decision. Trade doesn't really help us. So we push. What was the point of all of that? By the way, you see kind of two consecutive videos where I'm showing Carlsen's games. He actually employs this H-pawn push, right? We're kind of seeing a pattern here. And why is that nice to have a pawn over here? Because you're making inroads to black's king side. You're taking space. I mean, in the course of a long game, guys, this square could be important. I mean, you never know when a possible infiltration can occur as the game continues, right? So it's definitely helpful to have space and to have like nice juicy squares that your pieces can enter on potentially. So now what do we do? Okay, the knight has been kicked back. We still can't do anything on the king side. So we play in the center. And he starts pushing back the knight on c5. And then actually just returns with the bishop, right? Wasn't it nice that we kept him? Rook d8. By the way, guys, black is extremely passive. Notice how these knights are really relegated to the back of the board. They don't have outposts in the center. So black is holding the position, but he's holding it passively, right? There's not a lot of room for active counterplay for black. So he sits in place, rook d8. And finally, I really wanted to show this part. So watch this. The pawn is here. This pawn is here. We still can't win, guys. I mean, taking here makes no sense. I mean, they could even take with a knight. Like, why would we help their knight come out, right? Pushing and closing our bishop makes no sense. So what exactly are we supposed to do, right? The challenge is how to win this better position. Like, we know white's better. We know black is passive, but how to win? So a4. And really nice, right? How Carlsen plays all parts of the board. He's trying to weaken black up over here. And by the way, here black made like a pretty weird move with the F pawn, like lashing out. I mean, it's kind of just a pawn sack. I'm not really sure even what his idea was if white would take. But basically, Carlsen won this game pretty quickly after that. I mean, he just took the pawn. So this whole sort of attempt to sacrifice material, like block the pawn with the king. It was pretty weird and it didn't work out. And Carlsen won. But what I was curious about was, well, okay, what if black doesn't do anything completely crazy like that? What if they just, defend the pawn? Okay, so Carlsen will take, something will open up a little on the queen side, but still, where is the win, right? Like if black doesn't completely self-destruct, how do we win? So I decided to play this position out with a student of mine, and that's what we're going to look at next. So I was playing the black side and having my student play white, and I thought that she did, quite a good job at figuring out how to open up even more of the board from this position. So she played bishop e6. I mean, again, black can just sort of sit passively, right? She protects the bishop and attacks my knight. And she starts like this move. Okay, it's interesting. There's some sort of possible ideas maybe of taking and some sort of pressure here. Okay, I moved my knight. And then she goes b3. Okay, I'm kind of groveling there with my knights. Rook fd1, rook a8, and finally we see it, guys. So b3, not random, c4. So yeah, the game is opening up some more on the queen side, and the main threat is coming from this move, because white just wants to kind of make you take and just blast through and finally get to that king. It's a very annoying move. And if I mean, I could try to do that move, but after they take and things open up and the rook comes in, that also doesn't feel very good. There's, I mean, going to be a lot of power on the d file. So I tried queen a4, and I think maybe there was some slightly better way for her to play, but she played very sensibly with c5. And knight c4, and finally she took, right? So you don't give up a bishop like that, guys, without a really good reason. There has to be basically a tactical point because the bishop is so excellent. But at some point you've made enough progress that you can do it. So here, maybe the cleanest way for white to win is just to trade these pawns and come in with the queen. And basically, like, win this pawn. And it's not just a pawn that you're winning, because you're really sort of crashing through eventually on e5. So, you know, I was trying to defend. I thought, okay, this isn't the worst position I've ever seen, but it should be losing. Yeah, and it's kind of logical that eventually white crashes through somewhere. Well, I was a little bit lucky, like she played there, and then she took. And then at least, you know, I felt like it got a little bit unclear, even though white's still winning. And there's kind of a cool way to win here, basically involving the sacrifice of this rook. So instead of moving it, which is not a good idea, white could win by just taking and giving up the rook, counting on the d-pawn. Yes, white's really got powerful pieces, and they can even like just take the knight later and be winning. You know, black's king is just too open here. So anyway, let's just review that for a second, guys. This idea of opening up more of the board. Yeah, if you don't actually think of that strategy, you're going to have a hard time winning these better positions. Because if you only focus on the king side where your pieces are, it's not enough to win. So you really do have to look at all the parts of the board, and that's where this plan of like b3 and c4 came out of, right? So looking for resources everywhere. All right, guys. So I think kind of both Carlsen's game and like this sort of practice game, it gives you an idea of how important it is to improve your position on all sides of the board. Not just improve your position, but also try to probe your opponent's position, try to create weaknesses in his position everywhere, because the more that the more areas of the board that they have to worry about, you know, the harder it is for them to defend. And that's what it takes to break down resistance at the top levels.